Okay, and ZAA verbs, I don't really need to type out, well, I can go ahead. We just talked about it a minute ago that if your verb ends in ZAR, like almorzar, if I conjugate it out, I'm going to have almor, I'm going to have this. Okay. You were never supposed to have a Z next to an E in Spanish. You remember doing that with like luz and lápiz that you didn't. When you added your ES, you had to change your Z to a C. That's the same thing that happens here. So we're going to change our Z to a C because it's next to an E. And that's the only one that you have to worry about because in all the rest of the forms, it would be a Z next to an A or an O, which is not problematic. So any verbs that end in CAR, the C changes to a QU before you add the E. The change only happens in yo. Any verb that ends in GAR, you put a U between your G and your E, and it only happens in the yo. And any verb that ends in ZAR, you're going to change your Z to a C before you add your E, and that change only happens in the yo form. So let's go back and look at the practice that we were doing. Okay, so actually before going in and doing the practice, let's look at the other, there's more examples that we need to get to, but let's go ahead and look at this one as well. I had already told you that if you ever are conjugating out a verb and it ends up in the third person with where it would have an I, an E, an I, and an O, which, hold on a minute, and I'll pull up that example. Okay, so like I was saying before, I just went ahead and pulled up our chart again. I keep forgetting to bring that back in. If you're conjugating a verb like creer, okay, so let me go ahead and do that, even though it's, you can see it out to the side. If I stick that here, and I have the verb creer. Okay, if I conjugate creer out into the preterit, I would have creí, creíste, creíste, creío, creímos, creísteis, and creyeron. Okay, the problem arises if you'll notice Spanish doesn't like to have three vowels next to each other unless one of those vowels is silent. And in this case, none of the vowels would be silent. So if you look at the first example when we do in the preterit, you've got two vowels next to each other, not a problem. The second one, same thing again, two vowels. The third one, however, you would end up with three vowels next to each other. It would be creio, which is really hard to say. So what they do when that situation arises is they change the I to a Y. The next scenario, creímos, not a problem, two vowels. Creísteis, two vowels. Creyeron, here we would change our I to a Y. Creyeron, because again, we had ended up with three vowels next to each other. The same thing would happen with oír, which they show you as an example. I keep doing that. Okay. Oír, which would be oí, oíste. And see, if I did what I was supposed to, there's three vowels next to each other, o-e-o, too hard to say. So I would change again my I to a Y, oyo. Oímos, oísteis. And then here I would have again, oyeron. It's too many vowels next to each other, three that sound, so I'm going to change oyeron, too hard to say, but oyeron, much easier to say. Okay, so anytime that would happen with creer, leer, oír. Anytime you have a scenario in which you conjugate it into the preterite tense and it ends up with three vowels next to each other, this is what you're going to do. And examples that your book gives you are creer, leer, and oír. Okay, so if we go back to that first practice that we were doing in the second piece, I think there's only one verb, but anyway, el año pasado mis padres blank a Chile. Probably they're going to travel to Chile, which is viajar. Oops. So I am going to cut that. Okay, who is it that's doing the traveling? It's my parents, which is the same thing as saying they. Ellos. I'll put back in my verb, which is viajar. If it's an AR verb and it's ellos, if I scroll down, you can't, it's kind of cut off at the bottom, but it's ARON, so I'm going to get rid of, oh dear. Okay, so what I would do is I would get rid of that AR and I would add ARON. So here, allí ellos blank muchos mariscos deliciosos. Mariscos is seafood, so they probably ate a lot of delicious seafood, which is comer. Who did the eating? They did the eating. So if I take that ER off for an ER verb, that would be IERON, comieron. Muchos mariscos deliciosos. Mi mamá blank vinos excelentes. Beber, they drank. Who did the drinking? My mother. And if I look down here, my mother is the same thing as saying she. So it would be bebió. Okay. Pero a mi padre no le gusta el vino. Ellos también música típica, oír. Okay, and who is doing that listening? They were. Okay. Actually. Okay. So if I get rid of the IR, then the ending that I'm supposed to add for ellos is IERON, which would give me that situation where I would have three vowels next to each other. So rather than keep that, I'm going to change my I to a Y. Oyeron. Blank to un país interesante el año pasado. What's left is viajar. Did you travel? And because it's a question, you're going to find your subject after the blank. So it's to is your subject. Okay. And so then the ending for to would be viajaste. Viajaste tú a un país interesante el año pasado. Okay, so I'll do just a couple of these really quickly, just so you have a few more examples, but I'm not going to do them all. Here you're choosing between creer is believe, leer is to read, and oír is to hear, and all of these are those in which the third person you would end up changing your I to a Y. So, Maridu le blank a su hijo porque es un chico muy honesto y siempre le dice la verdad. So she believed her son, which is creer. So if I conjugate that for who's doing the believing, that would be Marilu, which is the same thing as ella. Okay, so if I plug my verb back in, I've got creer. That would be creo, but I can't have three together, so I'm going to change my I to a Y. Creyó. Oops. Creyó. Marido creyó a su hijo. Mis padres leen el periódico antes de salir de la casa. Probably read. That's what you would do with a newspaper. Leer. Who would be doing this reading? My parents, which is the same thing as ellos. Okay, so I put leer back in there. I get rid of this. Leyeron. Again, I've got those three vowels next to each other, so I'm going to change my I to a Y. Leyeron. And one more. Yo blank la música porque estaba muy alta. I heard the music because it was really loud. Oír. Okay, so who's doing the hearing? That would be yo. Okay, and it would be, I would get rid of this and I would add an I, oí, and I don't need to change it to a Y or anything else because that wouldn't put three vowels next to each other, so it follows the rules of any other regular preterit.